So today's webinar is going to cover custom field usage in Workamajig. So we're going to cover quite a few different places where custom fields can be used. We're going to cover why you'd use them in the first place, and how they're utilized. So at a base level, if we're just talking about custom fields in Workamajig, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So let's go ahead and get that pulled up. If we're just talking about custom fields in Workamajig, those are an additional data piece that you can add to our existing data types. The options you have to choose from are on this list here. So if they're not here, we don't have them. There are certain fields that we don't, certain transaction types that we don't have custom fields for a variety of reasons, notably things like invoices or journal entries. Those can't have custom fields applied to them. But pretty much everywhere else you see here in the system, kind of some major categories will be able to add custom fields. And some of them actually pull double duty. For example, your contact fields would also be visible in your leads as well. They kind of transition. So if you have a lead and you have custom fields in contacts, those custom fields will be there for the lead. And if you convert that lead into a contact afterwards, those custom fields will carry over for them. But effectively, it's just a way to capture, at least in the system custom fields, a way to capture additional data that we may not have a standard field for in the system. And custom fields will be visible in systems. So they can be a resource piece, just, hey, I'm on this client or I'm on this contact, and we have some internal pieces that are specific to us that Workamajig doesn't have fields for, but we'd like to capture in the system and for our team to be able to open that. So if we look into any of these categories here for contact fields, for example, I've got a couple set up. This is my test site here I'm using. So some of the stuff I have is a little bit goofy in terms of the names. I really use this to test workflows and system issues and enhancements, things like that. So hopefully some of this will translate over to you. But really what I want to cover today is how we use these, right? First of all, how do we create them? How do we enter them onto the various data pieces that we have here? And then how do we pull that utility out? Because aside from just basically being an area where we can say, hey, this is a potential vendor, or they have, a contact level satisfaction 1 through 5 that we can pull for them. Maybe we have a note field here for any additional information about this contact. Again, anything that wouldn't be in system fields. All of these, once we define them, will be visible at the contact level. So if I open up any of my contacts, I'm going to go into my views and pop open my contacts. If I open up any of my contacts in the system here, let's grab Bugs Bunny here, for example. Once you have any custom fields entered into the system here, they will be visible on that record. Now, this field is invisible if you have no custom fields. So if you go, hey, I've opened up a bunch of contacts, I've never seen a custom fields area there or in projects or anything like that, we typically hide this field until you use them. So this is kind of one of those situations where we try not to put too much in front of you here. When you're working with these detail records in the system. But this is a way I could manually change those, right? All 4 of those fields you saw in the custom field setup area there, I could say, oh, Bugs Bunny, pretty happy overall, right? Never really seen him upset, so we'll give him a 5. And that field will be visible both here at a top level. So the system will just kind of pop them out as they're added, just like this, right? I have 2 other fields kind of hiding behind this one. That we could be using as well here. But this information can also be pulled out into reports, and we'll talk about that towards the end of the call here. But for something like overall satisfaction, for example, I could aggregate this based off of my clients or my project type, for example. Like, how do we do in client satisfactions in these areas, maybe for account or project manager, things like that. Again, not something you have to use custom fields for, just kind of getting the ideas flowing, because by their very nature, custom fields are kind of specific to you and an additional detail pieces that you would want for your organization. So again, these can be pulled out into reporting. We'll take a look at that here, but let's kind of go back to the beginning and look at how we use these and kind of where they're used. So far, we've talked about this area here in system setup, and just to kind of orient you where this is, if I go back to my main menu, this is under Admin Manager System Setup. You would need to have the proper security rights to access both system setup and custom fields. There is a specific security right for setting custom fields that can be added. It's actually pretty easy to find. I believe if we just type in custom fields, it will come up. So it kind of gives you the ability to adjust those there. You can kind of decide who would have this right. Typically, I believe, if I remember correctly, the standard for our standard security rights, we start with project manager and up for the ability to create and adjust custom fields. But these are kind of our basic custom fields. Again, well, maybe basic's a mean way to refer to them as, but either way, kind of just a, hey, I need additional detail on my project or contacts. We can add those here. But these are also used in other places in the system, and knowing how to adjust it in one place kind of teaches you how to adjust it in all of those places. So we're going to try to do two things here to start this call. Number one, I want to show you where these can be adjusted. Kind of everywhere we'd see a custom field, even outside of this, right? We have custom fields here. We also have custom fields for things like spec sheets or project request forms. I'd like to speak to those. And so what I did for this call in particular is actually under the tracking area. We have the ability in Workamajig to define spec sheets. You've probably seen this option on your projects. We have 4 default spec sheets in the system for creative brief, photography, things like that. Those spec sheets are meant to be just kind of examples. You can, of course, take these and adjust them however you want, or you can create your own system-specific spec sheets. Now, mine here, again, some of these are ones that I've added afterwards. Some of them are pretty terrible. But the one I created here today is for this webinar. And really what I wanted to do with this is kind of show you how we work with custom fields in general. So this is obviously specific to spec sheets here that we're talking about, but the information that I'm giving you here will translate to defining custom fields in here or defining project requests, for example. There's also a few other niche areas you can use custom fields for things like if you use deliverables or deliverable types specifically, you can basically have custom fields on your deliverables using the same process that I'm going to show you here. So I made a spec sheet specific for this. This is probably not super functional from a day-to-day operation. And really the goal of this spec sheet is to kind of show you everything that we can do with custom fields. The different options that we have with them and how they all work. So when we're looking at setting up spec sheets or setting up custom fields into spec sheets specifically here, if we look at my webinar spec sheet, this is how these will always lay out. So this is good information, even if you want to adjust our existing. For example, we have like I mentioned, our default creative brief or our default photography spec sheets here. We put everything in here we thought you might need and use, but you may have some specifics, right? We have specific sizings we want people to be able to select from, or we want, the quantity field to be a drop down instead of just a data entry field. So those are all things that you can do. But this webinar spec sheet that I created is kind of meant to show off kind of all the things or most of the things that you can do with spec sheets. And so this specific spec sheet here, I'm going to go ahead and open up another tab. We'll go ahead and duplicate this one and leave it in the background so that we can go ahead and go to a project and play with this thing. Let's open that one. Perfect. So our spec sheets in your projects are here, right? And so what we're doing on this other tab, the first tab that we started on, is basically defining what these spec sheets are and what information that we're asking for here. And for spec sheets in particular, of course, these can be sent to vendors, they can be printed out, or they can just live in the system here as a detail piece if I'm working with this project to be able to see, okay, what are we working on, right? What specific specs are we working with here? And I can compare my deliverable to it. But when I hit this new button, it will show that same list we saw in system setup. So our first tab here is basically saying, what are these spec sheets? What are we asking? The second tab is saying, hey, I have a real project and I'd like to add a spec sheet to it. And I apparently have chosen almost a 5-year-old project, but you know what? Now is a better time than any for a spec sheet on it. So if I grab this webinar spec sheet, you're actually going to notice it's a little bit different than our setup here. And one of the first reasons for that is I have tabs on these spec sheets, right? I have different tabs for different areas. This is an optional piece, but when we look at the setup, when you see these bolded headings here, this has to lay out all of the information that you're being asked for. But with custom fields and with spec sheets specifically, you can kind of set them to be conditional to each other. So you can say, hey, I have a field for deliverable type, for example, that has a number of different options. And if somebody chooses one of these, I want different information to be prompted for them to enter once they select that. So let's look at one of these. Actually, let's start with our deliverable type field here. If I go into the edit option for this, before we create a new field, if I go into the edit option for this, we'll see kind of what you're being asked on the field itself. So each custom field, whether it's in a spec sheet or whether it's a custom field that we're using in a project, something like that, will always have a field name. This field name cannot have any spaces in it. So that's part of the reason I've used this underscore here. Um, in the field name. I definitely recommend setting your field names in a way that you can kind of prefix them so you know where they're being used. For example, I have the design tab here. I've named my field to design type just to make it easier to know which specific type I'm asking for. I may have multiple different types. For multiple different spec sheets, they may have different options, things like that. So this one's telling me, hey, it's specific to this tab right here. This is if you get really into these and make a ton of them. When you're working with spec sheets, one of the things you'll see is every field you've ever created that's not currently on the spec sheet will be available here on the right-hand side. And if you've never seen this area, our defaults, they have a lot of fields in them. So you'll see a whole bunch of options in here when you first pop this open. So when we look at our deliverable type here field here, for example, the caption is what actually shows. So the field name is a system piece. And for the most part, you're actually probably not going to reference your field by this. It just needs to be a unique name for the custom field itself. That we can pick up and the system can save it, and not save data over it. If we're looking at this in reporting, every custom field will always have the prefix CF underscore to it. I will show you that. So if that doesn't make sense of me describing it right now, I'll show it to you and it will, I promise. But that makes them easy to find. So if I'm running a report on my projects with the custom fields because I want that data, finding those custom fields is easy. Just typing in CF in the field name will go in and pull up all of the project custom fields that are related to it. But it's the caption that's actually shown on the custom field itself. So this is what the user or whoever's working with this spec sheet is going to see. They're going to see deliverable type here. And then directly below that is our display type. And this is really where you get some of the variety in the ability to control what kind of detail you're looking for in your custom field. Now, the top ones are all pretty self-explanatory. Numeric will only accept numbers. If I select numeric, it will ask me the number of decimal places that I want this to go to if we need them at all. You can set it to 0. Date and text, again, pretty self-explanatory. Date's just going to give you a date picker. I actually have one in this spec sheet, so I could show you that. And then you have text and text area. The difference in these is how much information you're prompting a user for. So let's actually go ahead and create a new one. I'm going to leave this field alone. We're going to create a new one. We're just going to call this one test. Actually, I probably already have a test. So we're going to call this one new test, just to make sure that we, we'll call it text field. How about that? So again, the field name itself is not really going to be visible to whoever's inputting detail. This is really, it needs to be unique to this field. Text field will be what shows up. And if I choose text here, for example, we're going to kind of ignore everything below this for now. And I search for that field here and I add it, we'll see that the text field is just a small text bar. Now, these actually expand pretty far. I can't remember exactly how many characters can be added to these, but it's actually quite a bit, and they do scale, right? So if I hit return, it will scale the field, but really it's kind of an indicator of how much information I'm asking for. And right now I'm saying, hey, I need it short and sweet. I don't really need that much stuff in this text field. That's the primary difference between text and text area. Text area prompts for more stuff, right? So this might say, hey, describe in detail the type of work we're doing on this project. You already have a field for that, but let's say that you needed to define a custom field for it. That might prompt someone to add more information, right? Please add detailed client notes, something like that. And this text field will obviously hold more information. It does also scale as well. So as you add more information to this, it will make the field a little bit bigger. But again, it's just kind of an indicator right out the gates that, hey, I'm asking more for than a couple of words here. I'm asking for some actual detail. So that's the difference between text and text area. Then we get into kind of some of the more flexible fields, things like the single checkbox or multiple checkbox. Single checkbox is basically a yes or no, right? So we can see now my text field has changed to a checkbox, right? That can be checked or not. This can be a, hey, has the client signed the scope of work? For example, here is my checkbox that I've used for this example. When they're filling out this spec sheet, they can click this or not click it. It kind of depends on whether or not the client signed the scope of work. So that's the single checkbox. But anywhere we get into multiple options, like our multiple checkbox, we're going to get an additional field that populates below our display type. And now is actually probably a good time to talk through these final three fields before I actually do that. So let's do that, and then we'll double back to our multiple checkbox in here. The description is actually internal. This is if you're looking at the list of options you have on the right-hand side here for your custom fields, this is your description, the another field with a conditional. I don't know if you can see this here. It's a little grayed out and kind of small, but that's really what that field does. It basically says, hey, this field for this single checkbox, this is why you would use it in a spec sheet. This won't show to a user. It won't show if you print it on a spec sheet. It's really just a way to say, hey, here's what this field does if you need it for another spec sheet. Now, the hint will show up on the field itself. So this is for the person that's inputting it, right? Let's say, please be descriptive or something like that. If I misspell descriptive, that would be terrible. There we go. So let me put that on here, and we can see that populates on the field itself. So when someone's filling out this spec sheet, this is a way to just give them more indications on what you want in the field itself. And you can have a default value in your fields as well. So if I set this back to text, for example, and I say the default value is, have a great day. That's exactly what will come up in that field when someone goes to create this spec sheet field in the first place. They can change that, but it's basically saying, hey, typically this is what we would want in the field itself. Or this is what we would most often use in the field itself, but it can be changed if you need it to. So obviously you don't need to use a default value. There's many, many instances where that would not be the case. But you can, for example, in a field where you have multiple checkbox options or a drop-down option, you can say, hey, typically it's this one. Let's start with that one and have somebody select it to something else. Most of the time, I try to encourage my clients not to use this field because sometimes people will forget. They'll go, great, there's something in the field itself. So they'll kind of gloss past it. That is definitely something that I would do. But again, that's kind of up to you and your team. Kind of whatever works best for you. You can use it if you need to, and it will set the value of the field automatically and maybe save some time when you're entering these custom fields in the first place. Now, below our default value field here, we have a few other options. Active says whether or not the field itself is active in the first place. You may have fields that you want to retire and not use on future spec sheets, but you've used on older ones. This is a way to kind of make them inactive, so they'll all be created as active by default. You can set a field to required. By default, this is not checked, so someone can save a spec sheet with missing fields if they need to. But you can pick out which ones you want them to absolutely have to fill out if they're entering a spec sheet into the system. This is especially useful in things like project request forms, where you may have a client or an internal department that's requesting a project from the marketing team. And you say, hey, this is something we need to know, right? We need to know your due date, or we need to know the number of pieces that you need, something like that. You can set those to be required so that those users, when they're submitting you a project request form, you're always getting that detail. You can also tell the system to not copy this field value. This is just if you're copying a spec sheet from one project to another. That's something that you can do. You can tell the system not to copy this one and require someone to enter it. So again, these two fields might work together. You might not use either of them for a field. They're just options that you have. And then finally, the display win allows you to control how much information you show at the beginning. So the display win specifically works by referencing another field, either containing or being exactly equal to another field information, right? So I'd say, hey, when field A has other in it, then I prompt a text field that asks them, okay, if you're selecting other, please describe in detail what you mean by other. It's a very common way to use this. I actually have a few in my example. So again, if this isn't making sense up front, I'll show you exactly how it works. But effectively, as soon as you click this, it says, okay, which other field do you want to reference? When you're using this, and does that field need to contain or equal the data that you use here? Again, I typically try to encourage people to use equals because contains can pull detail that you don't want. But again, it depends on the nature of the information that you're asking for and the specific type of spec sheet that you're working with. So we'll go ahead and uncheck that here. So we have our text field. We drag that into this here. We see our text information for it. And this first option here, when we're looking at overview, design, our post-project detail, again, if we go back to our project and we look at how this actual spec sheet works out, we're using a lot of display win in here. So when I look at my deliverable type field here, I defined a drop-down field. right? So it has its multiple options. When I selected dropdown, one of the things that happened here is this option field appeared. Again, this only appears when you would have a field that has a static number of options. And to define these, you'd basically do one option per line, right? So I'll get one line for collateral, one for media, one for brand outreach, et cetera, et cetera. And when we go back and look at the test here in the setup, we can see that those are the options that show up. Now, if they're on the same line, it won't work this way, right? If I have collateral and media on the same line like this, and I did this, it's going to say collateral media, right? So just again, know that they need to be on their own separate line. That's basically how these work here. And this is a static set of options. So this kind of works really well for that display win. So I defined in my first field that says, hey, what type of deliverable are we working with on this project? I can select from one of these two options here. And that's really where our display win comes into. So if we look underneath our deliverable type here, and we look at the specify the deliverable type, if I hit edit on this, this one's actually a parent field. So let's come back to that. Let's go to our collateral type. When we look at our collateral type field, it says, okay, this is its own separate dropdown with its own separate options for what type of collateral we're working with here. But this field only displays when my design type field, this one right here, I named it design type right under deliverable type here, equals collateral. Right, so this will only show up if I select collateral. And again, if I go to the actual spec sheet that we're working with, the live spec sheet we're working with in a project, and I pop over to my design tab, and I say my deliverable type is collateral, then we get a whole bunch more stuff, right? All of these fields are conditional to this being selected. So if I select something else like brand outreach, for example, or PR, for example, it takes those things away because it's smart enough to know, okay, we've set up this display win chain here that when I select collateral, it asks for the number of pieces, it asks for the specific collateral type that we're working with, et cetera, et cetera. And then we have another if other field here. So again, that's just something to keep in mind when you're building spec sheets or you're building a custom field workflow here. You're basically kind of defining in order how you would want these to show up. So even though our deliverable type, or excuse our quantity and our other fields, our collateral type fields don't show up until we select something from our deliverable type dropdown here, we still want them in the order we would want them to display when a user selects that and prompts the additional fields for it. So this other piece here for specify the deliverable type, this is a specific field here. This has a different set for it. So if I look at the deliverable type field again, one of the things we have is a parent field, right? It says, hey, the parent field to this is another field in the set. This is kind of another way of using display win, but making it a bit more adaptive. So you can kind of have a big list of options in one dropdown that are specific to another field being selected. So when we look at, let's set one of these as a parent field. Oh, excuse me, it's the collateral type. Nope, it's not. It is my deliverable type. Oh yeah, there we go. So our design type, this deliverable type field here, I should have named it deliverable type. This is going to be confusing, but it is this field, right? So the parent field for our design web field, that is this one right here, specify the deliverable type. We have this set up as set to what the parent field for this would be. And when you set these up in the first place, let me go ahead and create a new field or adjust our test text field here. Let's go and set this to a dropdown again, right? So there's only a couple fields where you can do this. Parent field is one of the options that will show up in certain situations, things like dropdown or multiple selection. It's basically saying, okay, there's going to be multiple options in this field here for how I want to use this custom field. And the parent field, when we select it and we say, hey, our parent field should be design type, this same field we were working with earlier, the system will actually let you know when you select these, well, at least the first time typically, how to set them up. There's a little text box that will come up to say, okay, if we're referencing this field, then the way to do this as a parent and child field is exactly how I did it here in the specified a deliverable type. The first part here is web with two colons here, and then the option that we want selected. So it says, okay, if someone selects web, these first four options will show up. If someone selects media, these four options will show up. And I could keep going, right? For whatever's in here. I could say, okay, if someone selects oh, this is the one here. If someone selects print or something like that, that's what will show up. So let me show you how this actually works on the field itself. If I select web, for example, we get that deliverable type dropdown, and we only get those four options: website, updates, maintenance, and graphic. So those will come through here for us. I have a couple questions. I'm sorry, Chris, I kind of let you left you sitting here for a minute, but I do see your questions. I'll show you how to add the tabs. The tabs are actually pretty easy, so I'll show you that here in just a moment. But Chris wants to know how to add tabs to a spec sheet. So these tabs, basically, overview, design, post project detail. And there's another question: is there a way to just restore the default spec sheets? Yeah, so we can restore the default spec sheets. You'd actually want to reach out to your account manager for that. They can basically restore any of the default information that's in the system, but we have to do it on our side. So just go ahead and send us an email at support@workamajig.com that you want the default spec sheets loaded again, and we'll get those loaded again for you. Yep, sure, of course. And if anyone else has any questions, please feel free to let me know. This can get a little bit complicated, especially in what I'm talking about here. So if it's not clear or you want some more detail on it, please don't hesitate to pop in. So let's actually, so again, hopefully this translates here. I said that the deliverable type is web. When we go back and look at the setup for the custom field here, again, our deliverable type here had all of this stuff, right? Updates, website, maintenance, graphic, right? So those four come through here as soon as I select web in the parent field for this. This is how these parent fields work. And so this first part tells us this is what someone needs to select. If they select media, then the option that they get in the dropdown here will be TV. And again, I added print, radio, digital, all of those. So we can kind of see how that works out. If we go to that deliverable type field in our spec sheet here and we say web, we get one set of options. But if I change this and I go to media, this same field will have a different set of options in it. So this is relatively new. I actually don't have a ton of clients using this just yet because I think that's a little bit, it can be a little confusing to start with how it works, but it's basically a more flexible way to set up those display win options. It says, hey, I don't want to define 6 different drop-down fields based off of what someone selects. I want one big drop-down field to rule them all. Honestly, either of the two ways will work for you. It's just a little bit cleaner to have it all contained into one field. And when you're setting up the actual spec sheet itself, it just reads a little bit easier, right? Because again, we're going to have to see everything here because we want to know all of the possible options that will show up. But that parent-child relationship between the fields kind of makes that a little bit more efficient. There are a couple of other field types I mentioned, for Chris here. For tabs, it's actually just the display type tab. And the way that these work when you're building these is each tab will be separated in its own separate area. So again, we see them all top to bottom in the spec sheet, but the way these bear out on the actual spec sheet when we're adding them is 3 separate tabs, right? Anything that was under overview will be right here. So I go back to my setup for the custom field, right? Just this information here. We go to the next set for design. Here's a whole nother set of fields. And then I have another one for post project detail here as well. That can be selected. So that's how you set tabs. It's just a matter of defining them and moving them under here. Obviously, if you're using tabs, you want at least 2 of them so that separation actually occurs, or you have separate areas to go. But it's just a way to keep a spec sheet list from looking like a mile-long list of questions. You can have them in certain areas. And often the way I see my clients use these is we may or may not need these 5 different sets of information. It might only be 3 of them. So I don't have to scroll past stuff I don't care about for this particular project because I have a spec sheet that references all of those 5 different pieces of information. Or if you have a project with multiple deliverables, for example, I could have a tab for one and a tab for another instead of 2 spec sheets if that's how you do things. Again, you typically want to keep these pretty flexible and not overstuffed. But if that was the situation, we could add these. So this one, again, this spec sheet's probably nothing y'all would ever use. Maybe there's some ideas in here you'd steal for your own spec sheets. But at the end of the day, the whole purpose of this spec sheet is just to show you what options that you have and how you can work with them. And so I defined a whole bunch here. So that's our tab. We can also see this field here. This is a display only field. So if I jump into this, it says display only text providing useful information, right? This is exactly what you think it is. It is only for display, right? So I could change the heading to be whatever I want. I named it display only, and then I gave it a value of display only text providing useful information. Again, you'd probably want to be more specific on yours, but this is something maybe to provide more detail to the person filling them out. But also it's worth noting that your display only fields will print as well. So if I print a spec sheet out of the system, this can be, for example, a disclaimer or a note to a vendor or something like that, right? Or just something that we want visible on each spec sheet that we display. So that's nice, not having to fill that out each time. This one says, hey, I don't need any input from the person filling the spec sheet out. I want them to just see this. And again, if we look at the actual spec sheet, you'll see exactly that. Now, for other fields that are in here, I've shown you drop downs. I obviously love drop downs. I use them a lot. There's a couple of different multiple selection fields. Like I mentioned, if I go all the way down to the bottom here, we'll see our date field in action. So this again is a specific date picker. It has to be a specific date and it has to be in this format. The system will assume year if you don't put it in, but again, needs to be, month, day, year, or whatever your system settings are. If your system settings are day, month, year, that works as well. But the default is, month, day, year. It's asking for a specific date, so you can type it in, or they can use the date picker when they're actually using these. And this isn't setting defaults or anything. The reason we have these on the setup is just to show you kind of how it would look if you're working with, once you actually publish the spec sheet itself. But I find it very useful, at least for spec sheets specifically, and sometimes for project fields, to do what I've just done here. Have two tabs open. Have one tab that says, okay, I'm working on this, I'm constructing this and making it to my specifications here. And then another tab that allows me to say, okay, I've set up all of this fun display win stuff here. Let's see how it works. Okay, great. I select collateral. Looks like the correct fields show up. Would always kind of give it a dry run. I just kind of like to do this the way that we have here. We'll see in this next field here that you can have a radio button. This is a single selection between three different options. So the radio button says, hey, you can pick this or this, but not both, right? Can't be yes and no that the job's done. It has to be one of these three different things here. So just kind of a different way of displaying the information. And this is a multiple select checkbox. So I believe in here, it will let you select multiples. So yeah, we can say, the feedback from our post-project survey, not surgery, was that the project was on budget, it was on time, we met or exceeded the client expectations, but maybe we didn't get clear communication feedback or something like that. And again, if we look into the construction of the field itself, it's the same thing, right? We're selecting multiple checkboxes as our display type to give us this particular setup here, and we're using the options to select what they can actually select from in the spec sheet itself. Okay, so that's a pretty good run for how these work here. Just a few other notes on the spec sheets as you construct them. Yeah, these can be exported and used in other ways. You can also edit the top level detail for them. So if you've never added a spec sheet, the same thing here. We need to add a spec sheet name and an ID prefix here. You can also set these as an active if you don't want to use them. Spec sheets are like a lot of other pieces in the system where if you've ever created one spec sheet from this particular setup, we can't delete the setup itself. We need it in the system here, but you can effectively hide it by making it inactive. Just a couple of other notes on the spec sheets themselves. Typically, if you were building this from a new spec sheet, I've got a test over here, so let's work with this one. We have this test set here. Typically, how this would work is I'd define a field and it would add it to this list here. And you can search by either the name or the field ID, right? So for our deliverable type, that is the field ID is design type, I could type in either design and it will give me that. There's our design type field right here, or I could type in deliverable. Either one of those two would pull it up. So it doesn't really matter how you reference it. I find most people reference it by what the caption for the field is, not the actual name of the field, the system field name for the field. But once you define these, you can drag them out by clicking and holding to where you want them on the field. And this is going to be really hard to see through the webinar, but if you play with this yourself, I promise it's a little bit more clear. There's actually a little gray line that shows up here that kind of shows you, oh, this is where I'm going to slot that. So if I take add size and drop it right here, That's exactly what it will do. And again, once it's in here, if I click on the caption, you want to click on the caption, not below it. It's just works a little bit better this way. I can move it. I can say, you know what, I'd prefer that to be down here, or I'd prefer it to be at the bottom, something like that. And that little gray field that shows up is a really great way to tell where specifically it's going to end up. So that click and drag kind of allows you to move these different pieces around. I would highly recommend if you have conditionals to try to stack them in order, right? I have a drop down with 4 options, and if they select, the 4th option for other, it prompts another field. I would highly recommend keeping those all together. It just makes more sense for you and for the person that's filling these in. And again, you can delete individual fields here, but if these fields are in use anywhere, like my audience field, if I try to delete it, it's going to tell me you can't. It's being used somewhere. But if I click in the field itself, the system will actually tell you which spec sheets are using this, right? So if you did want to remove one or change it around, you could do that. But the spec sheets themselves and the fields within them cannot be deleted if they're in use by anything, right? If I created the spec sheet ever, can't delete the spec sheet test spec sheet type. And if I've used a field for a spec sheet in any of my spec sheets, and they can be used multiple times in multiple different spec sheets, then I can't delete those fields themselves. Okay, so that's really spec sheets. And like I said, this really is going to let you know how the system is going to use custom fields in other areas as well. So I do want to jump over to project requests. Obviously, if you have any questions on spec sheets, how they work, how to define custom fields in them, please feel free to ask now or at any time here. But really, this information we're looking at here translates extremely well to project requests. And I would say this is not used by the majority of Workamajig clients, but they have specific utility. Primarily, project requests would typically be used by marketing communications teams or internal marketing agencies, right? I am the marketing department at a college, or I'm the internal marketing agency for a larger organization, and the work we do is specific to that organization only. That's really how we design these in the first place, but I have noticed more and more of my full agency clients that would have an external client roster using them as well. Basically, project requests are a way to say, I can give a member of my organization or one of my clients a login to Workamajig to be able to fill out a request for a new project. So I'll see for full agencies, for example, I'll see clients that have a retainer relationship or clients that say, hey, here's a bunch of money. We want, we're retaining you for a year. We don't know all of the projects we'll ask you to do, but, we do those projects up to a certain dollar amount and then we're out. This is a great way for them to request projects in a formal way where you can structure the information that you need from them before you engage that project. And those requests themselves have an approval process as well. So we can say, hey, we won't start this until someone internally looks at the information. If they need more detail, they can reach out to the client themselves. But yeah, oh, sorry. They can reach out to the client, reject it back to them. But let's look at the end of this and then we'll go back to the beginning. So this is where we would define them, right? This says, which project requests do we have? And by default, Workamajig does not actually have any of these in the system. The questions that you guys ask from your clients or from your internal clients are too variable for us to make one that's really functional out of the box. So we kind of make you define these. I do have a few that I've set up here. None of these are going to rock your world in terms of, again, you're not going to be like, hey, can I steal your carton design project request type? They kind of exist as a test and a way to show how this works. But again, I want to show a couple of different sides here. The first is that I mentioned that you can give your contacts a login to be able to view Workamajig. So we're going to look at our friend Bugs Bunny here as well. Again, I don't want to get too much into the client portal, the way that works. I at least want to speak to it as an overview and one of the way that project requests are typically input in the system. The client portal for a contact is a single page in Workamajig. They basically log in through the same app server that you use. So if you're on app 19 like me, your client contact would also log in through app 19 as well, with their own credentials. That can actually be set in the contact record. So if I open up Bugs Bunny or Elmer Fudd or any of my contacts in here, there is an area under the More button for contact settings where you can set this up. Right. So if we look into those contact settings, there's a security controls tab here that allows me to say, hey, their user ID is this. I'll set a password for them. I'll send them that information, and then they can log in through this page. Before you do that, you typically want to set the portal up. You can control how much they see and what they can do from that portal page itself.
But once you do that, you would want to set this information up. And some of you may have actually be using this client portal and not using project requests. That's perfectly fine as well. If you send out deliverable emails to your clients for review and you use the Workamajig link, that actually takes them to their client portal page. They don't actually have to have a login for that particular tool to work, but it is still taking them to the very same client portal page that you would use if they did have a login. So for any contact you have in the system, you actually have the ability to preview what their client portal would look like. And again, they basically would have a full screen version of this page right here. I could actually log in as Bugs if you guys really want to see this, but they'd see a full screen version of this page. They would not have the ability to go back to the main menu. It would just say whatever we wanted to label this page as. By default, I think we name it Client Vendor Portal, but you can change the naming for this if you want. Again, for Bugs Bunny, I've given him a lot of active use in the system to be able to see things here. But you'll notice one of the central pieces for this, especially for a new client that doesn't have history attached to them, is project requests. This is one of the main reasons we set this portal page up. So we can say, okay, Bugs Bunny needs a new project, right? We hit the plus button here for them. And these are the project requests that they can choose from. And when they do that from the client side or from the internal user side, when they select, let's go ahead and grab our carton design here. Workamajig is going to prompt a number of pieces of information here for them. So again, we're going to be using custom fields to kind of build out what information we ask for. This particular spec sheet's not the best. We call this new new project. I'll just have to keep adding news until I run out of the ability to type new here for my new projects. But again, we could set our preferred colors. I'll say those three. I'll say that the size for this is, I don't know, we'll just put big in here. This is probably how a client would fill this out, honestly. I want a big one. So you can kind of, again, select these. You can see if I don't have required fields, those don't come up here. For project requests, you can also require spec sheets as well. I don't know why this one's asking the client for a creative brief, but I did. You can actually see a default value and how it works here as well when you're entering these. Again, I think I'm asking for 2 separate spec sheets. Yeah, I'm asking for 2 separate spec sheets on this one. I'll show you how that works in a moment. You don't have to ask for any spec sheets on a project request, but I've asked for 2. And then finally, they'll get to a page that says, okay, review all of your stuff, right? Your request details, make sure that that's correct. The creative brief and the publication specs, make sure that those all make sense, and any other attachments. And then they're able to submit this into the system. So this is a request until it's approved and turned into a project. Again, I'm not going to go too deep into how that works. I just want to highlight that for you. If you want more information on that, probably best to talk to your account manager about how that works. But when we're looking at setting up a project request form, so I'm going to go back to our admin manager page here. I'm going to jump back into system setup. I'm going to go into tracking. This is where both our spec sheets and our project requests are controlled and created. When we look at the actual construction of this in system setup and we look at that carton design field here, we can kind of unspool what we just saw, right? There are 3 major components to a spec sheet. Actually, probably 4. So first is access. This is who can request this. And they can be internal users, or again, they can be clients, either of the two. Most often they're clients, but you may also have internal users that request projects as well. I have a few organizations whose account managers kick off a project by sending in a request to a PM who would then approve it and then turn it into a live job afterwards. So there's a couple different ways to use this if you want to. This access field here controls who can actually see this, right? I might have 7 different project requests, but I only want a person in this position, whether they're a contact or an internal user, to be able to use 3 of those project requests. From there, you also have your approval process. I mentioned that your project requests do need to go to approval for somebody. And so you would basically set up what that approval process looks like. This one's pretty simple for me. I just have a step called approval. It goes to this user Candace whenever this project request is submitted, and their approval would get a notification in the bell icon here that they have. I actually have like a project request to review. And so the reviewer would be able to approve it or reject it from there. So you'd want to set up an approval process. This is the most consistently what I see people forget on these. So please don't forget to set an approver and who needs to say yes on these things before they go into process. Your spec sheets, yeah, I mentioned I had 2 spec sheets attached to this. I can have it be 0. Actually, probably would make more sense for this particular project request. But this again can prompt a user to say, hey, if you're sending in this project request, you also need to fill out the spec sheet for me. And then finally, the meat and potatoes is the request itself. We would set up the custom fields here. So what we're asking for in the request itself. Now we do have a couple questions here, so I'm going to stop and grab those real quick. Regarding are there any webinars or plans for deep dive into the client portal? Yes, and we've actually done a few client portal and project requests webinars previously, so those would be on the website itself. I can almost guarantee you this is something we'll do again. This tool itself is pretty handy, and we find a lot of clients that actually need it don't even know it exists. So we've been trying to kind of make sure we put it out there so that you guys can take advantage of it. But yes, there are previous webinars that cover this specifically. You'll want to look for project requests, probably more than likely on that side, but I do believe we've done some specific to the client portal as well. Then I had another question here regarding if we have a custom field pertaining to a client or a vendor, would that be able to show up on a project's main dashboard? Unfortunately, they don't. For a project's main dashboard, it needs to be a project custom field. So yeah, so they're kind of separated in that way. But good question. Now, for our project request itself here, I mentioned the request area here itself, this setup custom fields is kind of the meat and potatoes of what we're asking for. So all of those options we saw on the request form itself, all of these fields work exactly how we saw in spec sheets. So if you know how to change them there, you know how to change them here, and all of the same options exist. We can do display when fields, we can make things required, we can use tabs, things like that. But again, same exact setup, the same exact tool here for how to adjust these. It shows in the same order, and in the same way, we can drag fields out and use them into one specific project request type here. And if we want to go back to the beginning, all the way to our project requests, and we hit a new one here, you'll notice for requests themselves, we have a few other pieces of detail I want to touch on at least briefly. Of course, we'll name the request. This is what users will see when they go to select those. Each one of your requests needs a prefix. So if it's collateral, for example, you could do COL. We number all of your project requests so you can tell which one's which, right? This is request for collateral 17, something like that. And a couple of big things I'd like to point out in here. Again, I don't want to go too deep into this because we have had other webinars that cover this. But you can set a minimum number of days that a user can select for their project request. And the way that this works out, if I say, hey, 7 days, this is 7 business days, first of all, so it won't count the weekends for you. And the way that works here, oh, I'm on a new request. Let's see if this one actually has one. Yeah, this one has a 30-day minimum. Wow. Okay, so a 30-day minimum for this. The way that would actually bear out for the user or the contact when they fill these out, let's go back to Bugs Bunny. So if I'm Bugs Bunny, I'm on my client portal and I say I need a new project request and I need a new carton design request, one of the ones we were just working at. One of the questions the system will ask you is for the due date. And by default, we actually set this to the earliest due date that they can select, right? So this is that 30 business days from today's date. If I go back and try to set it to the first here, when I go to save the request form itself, let's just put a 1 in there. The system will give me an error and let me know, oh, I guess maybe not for this one, but it will let me know that the due date needs to be, a minimum of 30 days or whatever number that we've entered in there. So I like to let my clients know about this. This is very handy, especially if you have internal requesters that are like, hey, we need this tomorrow, and that's unreasonable. This is a way to kind of gatekeep those and say, hey, the minimum you could choose is next week or something like that, 5 business days, something to that effect. Your project request can be linked to a specific template. So you can say whenever we use this request, also pull these tasks from an existing template. You do have emails that go out for these, both to approvers and to the requester themselves. So you can customize what those emails look like. And then you have a lot of control over what we do with a request after it's created. You could add the person that requested it to the project team. This for contact users gives them visibility into it, things like that. Again, I don't want to go through each one of these options here, but when you define a request in the first place, we kind of ask for some top level information. And then when you go to the second page of the request, it's going to take you here, right? Directly to say, okay, what kind of fields do you need to ask for somebody when they're making a project request in the system? And this is what they'll be asked for. So again, just make sure you fill out those categories. At the very least, you need these 3 things filled out. You need an approver when this is sent for approval. You need to set who has the rights to send this request in the first place. And then you need to set up the actual fields for it and how they would work and flow in the request itself. So those are project requests. Again, the custom field pieces for that very similar to what you would see in spec sheets. And and finally, I want to round it out here with the data piece custom fields. Well, time is flying by here, so we're getting a little crutch, but I want to make sure that we show these here. So again, these are the categories that you have to be able to add custom fields. So if we look at my project fields, for example, again, these are fairly goofy. Some of them may actually look like they have utility, and others this, that, their option or no option. Probably not super useful to you, but again, this is kind of just a way to test how these work. The fields, again, themselves work the exact same as we've seen in spec sheets and project request forms. So you can lay them out as text fields, as dropdowns, as multiple selections, whatever you want. Those are all there. This one is a little bit of a unique one. I have a select list. That's one that we haven't seen just yet. That select list allows me to choose multiple different pieces in here. Right. So I could say, oh, we can't call in Utah and California, for example, for this particular one. So can kind of choose from a select list that I define and allow people to select those. This is really nice if you have 50 states in here, for example, instead of creating a 50 set checkbox option where they go through, you can just give them a drop down that's, hopefully more alphabetized than mine is here that allows them to select them from a drop down list. But as soon as you've defined your project custom fields or custom fields anyway, or anywhere for contacts, for employees, you can have custom fields for companies. This applies to vendors or clients. So companies would cover either. You can use them on conversations. You can use them on opportunities, for example. You can also use them on deliverables. There's a lot of different places for them. The process for defining them is the same. You'd add a new available field. You'd then drag that over here and set them in the order that you'd want. And for any of these here, again, when we're looking at them, if I look at a project, so let's stay in the same tab here to keep this from being not so confusing. If I look at any of my projects, now that I have custom fields, there's a couple different places where you can display these. You can display them in the grid right here, or you can display them on the left. The benefit to having them in line here on the right-hand side with your conversations and deliverables and whatnot is that we will actually show the data, right? So for blocked states, for example, I don't know why I have a 1 in here. Maybe that was one of my options, but I could say, oh, those are my 2 blocked states. They took this option. The brand is, Acme and so on and so forth, right? When I save those and add them, again, they will just display within the project itself here and allow us to see that. And, that's kind of how your custom fields trickle down. And you may, when you define custom fields, go shoot. It would be really nice to have this on previous projects. So let's say that you actually start taking surveys from a client, 1 to 5 here, and you've been doing this for a long time, but you've never actually entered it into Workamajig, and now you want it in here for the reporting purposes. Because again, for example, I could take a big list of my project survey scores and say by client or by project type, what's the type of feedback that do we get? Like, what do we score highest on? What are people happiest about? You can do that here and pull that information out into your views or into custom field data sets. Now, if we look at the projects, I'm going to go into my project views here, for example. Oh, actually, they're not. I don't think our custom fields are in here, but so custom fields typically would be in custom reporting. There are some that show up in many. I actually think the projects one is one of the exceptions where it does show up in views. It does. Yeah. So let me go look at my modify here. Yeah. So when we're looking at a view for projects. Now, this is specific to some of these. Some of them you have to dig a little bit for, like employee custom fields in reporting. You have to use specific data sets. You can't use the employee views data set to look at employee custom fields. I don't know why that is. I've complained about it a few times, so hopefully we'll fix that in the future. But for the most part, you can look at them in most standard reports. And just kind of pull them out. And if we modify, I mentioned this a bit earlier, but when we're pulling out custom fields, if you type in CF, it will give you the list of which that will give you all of the custom fields that you have. So if I want to see the survey score for all of my projects, for example, I could put that in here. We'll put that right after project number, for example. And I search this. it will give me that actual score within this detail here. So what was ever in that custom field, it'll pop out here and show us that information. And again, I could run calculations off of this. I could aggregate it. I could group the detail together by the project type and then average it, something like that. Those are all possible. Again, we do have webinars on reporting that will get a bit into that as well here. Oh, it looks like I've displayed it twice. But again, you can pull those custom fields out in reporting. And one of the other things I like to show in views that is easy to lose is that if I added something like this later, and let's say I had all these survey scores, but I have a whole bunch of projects where there's no survey in them, right? And I want to come in and add that information later. If you use these checkboxes in views, and most views will apply to this. So whether it's contacts or companies or projects, for example, you have the option to mass update project fields. So for these 5 projects I get selected, I could say, hey, I need to change the account manager on these, for example, or I need to change the project status to closed or something like that. But you can also mass update your custom fields as well. So we can say, oh, all 5 of these projects had the survey score of 4. Let's go ahead and save that. And again, I can update all of them at the same time, right? I can say, oh, I want the brand to be this. I want this to be that. So you don't have to do it with multiples. For example, this might just be an efficient way without having to open up 30 projects to update the custom field information. But this is also a nice way for me to update that information in mass. And Jack was asking, can you pull up the custom fields in views or reporting? But yeah, I kind of answered that a little bit, but it's a little bit of both. Some of them are a little bit different, right? Things like I said, employees. There are specific data sets, right? So if I go back to my report center here, if I look at employee views, I won't be able to see the custom fields there. But if I go into a custom report and I look at let's just type in employee. There is a time detail data with your employee custom fields, for example, that will pull them up. And I believe employee data gives you custom fields. There's a couple of these that do. I'd have to look at which ones they are, but there are some exceptions. But for the most part, pretty much any report that touches that data set will give you the option to look at those custom fields. So if I look at companies or contacts, for example, let me just jump into all contacts and I modify that here and I hit that CF. Again, all of my custom fields for my companies will show up. And I mentioned there's certain situations where you can transfer detail. Like if I have an opportunity with custom fields, I can map them to project custom fields. You can also on your project request forms map the detail entered in project request forms to project custom fields. So to the question, someone asked earlier if I could see things like client custom fields in a project. No, you can't do that, but you can say, hey, I have a project request form where I ask for information that's specific to our workflow, and I want the information in that field deposited into a project custom field as well. So you don't have to enter it in both places. The system will just transition that for you. Let me show you that here real quick. I'm actually going to go back to our project requests here. When we're looking at the cart design here that I was working with earlier, if I look at the edit field for this, you'll see for project requests specifically, there's a map to field here. And this says, oh, okay, this is the field I'd like this to be mapped to on a project when we create this this project from a project request form. So there's a lot that you can do with these. To me, just knowing that they're in place, I'm surprised consistently by how many of my longstanding clients don't know that these are here when they say, hey, we have a field we need that Workamajig just doesn't have in the system. Well, we've tried to make it as easy as possible for you to be able to pull this information out here. And to be able to define your own custom fields here in the system. And again, they're kind of all over the place. Primarily, the most 2 commonly used places for them would be our custom fields themselves, right? A new custom field for a contact or a project, but also in spec sheets and project requests. These are the other 2 areas you'll primarily see them. There's a few niche pieces as well for things, like I said, if you use deliverables and you use deliverable types specifically, you can define custom fields on those as well, but those will kind of pop up in their own specific area. It won't be a secret that those are there. If you're setting up deliverable types, you'll see that those custom fields are available to you. So in a nutshell, right? Workamajig has a number of different custom fields here and custom field options that you can use. The base level is just I want to add something to an existing data type. Others have workflows around them, things like your spec sheets, things like your project requests. Those are kind of a different way to get to the same information. But at their core, they're a way for you to define information that's kind of specific to you as an organization or specific tracking pieces that you need that we don't have fields for in the system by default. I would always look for the default fields first if they're there. If they don't work for you for some reason, like, hey, we'd rather this be a dropdown, then custom fields are kind of a really good option for you. All right, so I kind of talked right up here to the end, but if you guys have any other questions or if there's anything else that you want to see here, please don't hesitate to pop those into the chat. I'll give a few moments here at the end if you guys like. But I think you guys are pretty good about asking those throughout the course of the call here. So as usual, if you want more information or if you want just kind of something more specific to your processes, please don't hesitate to reach out to us here. We're at support@workamajig.com. So if you want a training on these or if you just have questions for your account manager, don't hesitate to reach out. We're more than happy to help with these. I just want to thank you guys all for taking the time here to jump into this webinar. Hopefully it was valuable for you and you took a lot of information away from it. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I hope you guys have a great day.